On October 30th, 2017, Kim Joo-hyuk's life ended in the kind of way that leaves a whole country unable to process what it has just heard. It was not a slow farewell. It was not the last chapter of a public downfall. It was not the ending of a man people had already begun to lose. It was a traffic accident in Seoul, sudden and brutal, and the first reports felt almost impossible to accept because Kim Joo-hyuk did not seem like someone whose story should break apart in a single afternoon. He was 45. Old enough to have earned trust, warmth, and a certain emotional permanence in the lives of the audience, but still young enough to feel as though he had many years of work, growth, and ordinary tomorrows ahead of him. News spread quickly that his car had collided with another vehicle, crashed into an apartment wall, and gone down a stairway near the scene. Then came the harder line, the one that turns shock into reality. He had died. Later reporting said the fatal cause was a severe head injury. That detail made the tragedy even colder, because it reduced a familiar face, a beloved actor, and a man who had lived so vividly on screen to one violent point of impact. This is what made the public reaction so immediate and so raw. Kim Joo-hyuk was not merely known, he was trusted. He belonged to that rare category of actor who had moved beyond stardom and into something gentler, the feeling that he would simply still be there, part of the texture of Korean film and television, part of the ordinary future people assumed would keep unfolding around him. And then, without warning, he wasn't. What made his death even more painful was the kind of life it interrupted. Kim Joo-hyuk was not standing at the edge of irrelevance, scandal, or visible collapse. On the contrary, he seemed to be living through one of the richest phases of his career. He had already built a respected filmography across romance, drama, period work, and darker, more mature roles. He had also shown audiences another side of himself through variety television, where he seemed warm, awkward, funny, and deeply human in ways many actors never allow the public to see. That mixture mattered. It meant people did not mourn him only as a performer. They mourned him as someone who felt emotionally familiar. When the autopsy later confirmed there was no heart problem and identified the cause of death as fatal head trauma, it only deepened the feeling that this had been a theft rather than an ending. Nothing about the public image surrounding him had prepared people for the possibility that one ordinary day could become the last. That is the wound at the center of Kim Joo-hyuk's story. Some celebrity deaths feel like the final note in a long song of destruction. His felt like a sentence cut off mid-breath. Before he became a wrecked car, a funeral hall filled with flowers, and a line of devastated colleagues waiting to pay respect, Kim Joo-hyuk had been something much simpler and much harder to lose. A man people thought would stay.
Long before Kim Joo-hyuk became the kind of man audiences trusted without even realizing it, he was simply a boy born into a world where acting already had a shadow and a legacy. He was born in Seoul in 1972, the son of veteran actor Kim Mu-saeng, which meant that from the beginning, performance was never something completely distant from family life. But being born near a legacy is not the same as inheriting peace from it. Sometimes it means growing up under a name that arrived before your own, under expectations you did not create, and inside comparisons you never asked for. That is the emotional core of Kim Joo-hyuk's early life. Before the public knew his smile, his warmth, or the calm sincerity he would later carry on screen, he was a young man forming himself in the presence of another actor's reputation. He studied theater and film, but the path in front of him was never guaranteed to feel fully his. The danger of being someone's son in an industry like this is that the public watches you twice, once for who you are, and once for whether you deserve the name behind you. That kind of beginning can quietly shape a person. It can make ambition feel heavier, success feel conditional, and identity feel like something you have to build in front of people who are already waiting to compare. But what makes Kim Joo-hyuk's early story worth telling is that he did not rush into becoming a symbol. He had to grow into himself. Before the films, the awards, the variety show warmth, and the public affection, he was still a man trying to step out from behind inheritance and become visible on his own terms. That matters, because so much of the pain in his later story comes from how fully he eventually did that. He was not remembered simply as the son of Kim Mu-saeng. He became Kim Joo-hyuk, with his own face, his own emotional rhythm, his own way of making audiences feel they were watching someone honest. But in the beginning, none of that was settled yet. There was only the pressure of legacy, the uncertainty of early adulthood, and the long, unseen stretch before the public learned to love him for himself. And maybe that is the first quiet sadness in his story. Before he became a man the country would mourn, he was just a son trying to become more than the expectations waiting for him. By the time Kim Joo-hyuk became a familiar face to the public, what made him special was not just that he could lead a film or carry a drama. It was that he never seemed trapped inside one fixed image. Some actors spend their whole careers being variations of the same person, polished into something easy for the audience to recognize and impossible to mistake. Kim Joo-hyuk moved differently. He could be gentle without losing gravity, masculine without turning cold, romantic without becoming shallow, and wounded without falling into self-pity. That flexibility is one reason his career felt so rich by the time he died. He was not only popular, he was respected in a quieter, deeper way. Early television work helped build his public face, but Lovers in Prague changed the scale of that recognition and won him a Baeksang Best Actor award, proving that he was more than a reliable leading man with a familiar surname. From there, his filmography grew in a way that made him harder and harder to reduce to any single label. In Mr. Handy, Mr. Hong, he could charm. In My Wife Got Married, he could hold emotional contradiction. In The Servant, he could step into something darker and more sensual. In Yourself and Yours, he moved through ambiguity with unusual control. And by the time he appeared in projects such as Confidential Assignment, Believer, and the newsroom drama Argonne, he had already become the kind of actor audiences trusted to make adult emotions feel real rather than theatrical. That matters because Kim Joo-hyuk's appeal was never built only on beauty or star presence. It was built on the feeling that he could inhabit grown, messy, complicated lives without forcing them to look dramatic. The public was not only watching a star stay famous, it was watching an actor age into the most convincing version of himself. But the reason his death hurt ordinary viewers as much as film people lies just as much outside his scripted roles. If cinema and television built Kim Joo-hyuk's artistic reputation, 2 Days and One Night changed his emotional place in the national imagination. When he joined Season 3 in late 2013, he was already an established actor, but variety television showed people something they rarely get from movie stars: awkwardness, humor, hesitation, warmth, and the slow, unguarded rhythms of a person who does not seem to be performing fame every second. He became Kdrama, an older brother figure audiences could laugh at and feel protective toward at the same time. That is what transformed him from a respected actor into someone much closer. Viewers did not only admire him from a distance, they began to feel as though they knew his emotional weather. When he left the show in 2015 to focus more on acting, the departure already felt meaningful because it marked the end of a very human connection people had formed with him. And when he died in 2017, that connection came crashing back with devastating force. KBS aired a special in memoriam episode of 2 Days and One Night, and the members recorded final goodbye messages that turned public mourning into something painfully intimate. That is why Part 3 matters so much in the structure of this story. Kim Joo-hyuk was not only a skilled actor in successful films and dramas, he was also one of those rare public figures who had managed to become emotionally familiar without losing dignity. By the time his life was cut short, he had reached a place many actors spend decades chasing: a career with depth, a public image without scandal, and a warmth that made people feel he would remain part of Korean screens for a very long time. He was no longer just building a name. He had become the kind of man the public quietly assumes will stay. And that is exactly why losing him felt less like the end of a celebrity career than the sudden removal of someone already woven into everyday emotional life.
What makes Kim Joo-hyuk's story so difficult to bear is that there was no long public unraveling leading up to the end. He was not the kind of celebrity people watched falling apart in slow motion. There had been no wave of scandal, no visible collapse, no months of chaos teaching the public to expect disaster. If anything, the opposite seemed true. Professionally, he was in one of the richest periods of his life. He had moved past the uncertainty of early stardom and into something deeper, the kind of adulthood on screen that only a few actors ever learn how to embody convincingly. In projects like Argonne, he looked settled inside himself, older in the best sense, carrying the kind of authority that does not need to announce itself loudly. And off-screen, his life also appeared to be entering a new chapter. In late 2016, his relationship with actress Lee Yoo-young was publicly confirmed, and that fact quietly shaped the way many people saw him in his final year. Not as a man drifting, but as someone continuing forward, still building a life that had not closed itself off from love, intimacy, and ordinary future. That is why his death felt less like a tragic conclusion and more like a theft. It interrupted a life that did not seem to be ending anything. It seemed to be deepening. The public was not bracing for loss. It was simply assuming tomorrow would come and that Kim Joo-hyuk would still be inside it. That is also why the aftermath of the accident became so haunting. Because there was no emotional narrative ready to explain it, people went looking for one. Early reports raised questions about whether he might have suffered some kind of medical emergency before the crash, and the confusion only sharpened the feeling that this death had come from nowhere. But the autopsy later established that Kim Joo-hyuk died from a severe head injury, and subsequent police findings said there was no evidence of alcohol or drugs in his body. Those details did not make the loss easier to understand. They made it colder. There was no scandal to blame, no recklessness to moralize, no hidden decay the public could point to and call the real beginning of the end. There was only fragility, only the unbearable truth that a person can be walking through a completely ordinary day, carrying a respected career, a loved public image, and a future still open in front of him, and still vanish in one violent instant. That is what gives Kim Joo-hyuk's story such a specific kind of ache. His death was not a spectacle of self-destruction. It was a reminder that life does not always announce its worst moments in advance. Sometimes it takes someone who looks steady, warm, and entirely alive, and removes him before the people who love him have even had the chance to imagine a world without him. And maybe that is the deepest wound in this chapter. Kim Joo-hyuk had already become the kind of figure audiences unconsciously file into the category of permanence, not because he was dazzling in an untouchable way, but because he felt familiar, grown, and emotionally reliable. He seemed like someone who had already survived the unstable years and entered the part of life where the future widens instead of narrowing. That illusion shattered the moment his car struck, and nothing that came after could put it back together. The tragedy of Kim Joo-hyuk is not only that he died. It is that he died at the exact moment when everything in his life seemed to suggest he would stay. When Kim Joo-hyuk was finally laid to rest, the grief around him took on a shape that felt heavier than ordinary celebrity mourning. It was not only sadness over a famous actor who had died too soon. It was the shock of watching someone the public had already placed in the category of permanence suddenly become a funeral portrait carried through hospital doors. Yonhap reported that his private funeral was held on November 2, 2017, at Asan Medical Center in Seoul, attended by family, staff from Namu actors, and close colleagues, including actors Jung Jin-young and Hwang Jung-min. After the service, his body was moved to the family grave in Seosan, South Chungcheong Province, while around 200 fans gathered outside the hospital to say goodbye. Those details matter because they reveal the scale of the loss in the simplest possible way, not through spectacle, but through who came, who waited, who stood there in silence because they could not believe the person inside the coffin was the same man who had felt so alive on screen and on variety television only days before. Yonhap also noted that movie publicity events and screenings were postponed in the wake of his death, which says something important about how deeply the shock spread through the industry. Kim Joo-hyuk's passing did not feel like the end of one isolated career. It felt like the sudden interruption of a familiar emotional presence that had quietly become part of Korean entertainment itself. And maybe that is what made the funeral so painful to witness. He was not being buried as a fallen star surrounded by scandal. He was being buried as a man people still liked, trusted, and expected to keep seeing. That is a very different kind of grief. It is not the grief of watching destruction reach its final chapter. It is the grief of realizing that an ordinary future has been taken away from someone who seemed to be living fully inside it. That is why Kim Joo-hyuk's story leaves behind such a lingering ache. After his death, old clips and still images did not return to the public as mere nostalgia. They returned as evidence of how much life had still been moving through him when everything stopped. His films felt different. His scenes in 2 Days and One Night felt different. The smiles, the awkward warmth, the grown-up steadiness that had made him so easy to love, all acquired a new sadness, because the audience now knew what he himself never did in those moments, that he was much closer to the end than anyone imagined. This is where his story becomes more than the story of a traffic accident. It becomes a story about false permanence, about the people we assume will remain because they seem too grounded to disappear. Kim Joo-hyuk did not carry the aura of self-destruction, so the public never learned how to prepare emotionally for losing him. He felt like someone already past the dangerous chapters, someone who had survived youth, uncertainty, and career building and entered the more stable, richer part of life. That illusion made the loss deeper. When a very young star dies, the tragedy often lies in unrealized potential. With Kim Joo-hyuk, the pain was different. The pain was that he had already become real to people. He had already become the kind of actor and public figure who fits into the idea of tomorrow. And then tomorrow arrived without him. In the end, that may be the most haunting thing about his story. He did not leave behind a mythology of chaos. He left behind an emptiness, a chair left occupied only by memory, a familiar voice cut out of the everyday, A face that now belongs to funeral flowers, tribute episodes, and the terrible sentence people say only when they still cannot believe what happened. He should have been here much longer.